but I was down early, anxious to see if anything had happened about Holmes and his book. Nothing had apparently, for he was sitting, small and semi-grimy and entirely cheerful, over a substantial breakfast in the servants' dining room. He rose when I went to the door and grinned sheepishly, and I saw then that he had been reading Mother's newspaper, which is supposed to be untouched until it is placed beside the coffee tray for her. "Just taking a look at the inquest, miss," he said. "Looks as though the press had it in for the police, as well as for Mr. Wellington. They have to have somebody, Holmes." He gave me one of his furtive looks. "Maybe. Maybe not, miss. I was wondering if I could have the afternoon off. I'd like to go out to my little place, if it's convenient." "I think it will be all right. Just where is this little place of yours, Holmes?" But he was noncommittal. "Out the North Road a ways," he said, and thanked me. I did not pursue the matter, a fact which I have since regretted, but just then I saw George Talbot, aimlessly knocking a golf ball about and keeping an eye on the rear of our house, and I wandered out to the back garden, where he joined me. "I want to talk to you," he said in a low voice. "How about the garage? Where's Holmes?" "Eating his breakfast." We sauntered as casually as possible toward the garage, George swishing his club about as though looking for a lost ball. Probably all this was unnecessary, for I knew the servants would have joined Holmes at the table, and except for the Daltons no one else could see us. Once inside, however, George's manner changed. "Listen here, Lou," he said. "There was hell to pay last night. See what you make of this." Then he told me. He had been out to dinner and bridge, and got home at 1. His mother had been hard to rouse, but at last his Aunt Lydia had heard him, and securing the front door key from Mrs. Talbot, had let him in. He was in a bad humor, apparently. "It's such senseless absurdity," he said. "And she's getting worse, Lou. She's had bolts added to some of the window locks since the murder, and getting into her room is like getting into the Bastille." That with a woman who is normal in every other way. "I've tried to get her to a good psychiatrist, but you'd think I'd suggested giving her poison." The story, however, had little or nothing to do with Mrs. Talbot's aberration or whatever it was, except that Miss Emily was apparently escaping from something, and had chosen the safest place she could think of. George had been too irritated to go at once to sleep. He had tried reading instead, and at 2 o'clock he heard someone ringing the bell and then pounding on the front door. He heard Lydia moving in her room, and he met her in the upper hall. She still had the front door key, and he snatched it from her and ran down the stairs. Emily Lancaster almost fell into the hall when he opened the door. She was as white as paper and looked wild and terrified. "Hide me, George," she gasped. "Hide me somewhere. They're after me." He fastened the door behind her, and she seemed to come to herself again, enough at least to draw her dressing gown around her. Lydia had come down by that time, and Emily had collapsed into a hall chair and was staring ahead of her with a strange look in her eyes. As George said, there was no sentiment about his Aunt Lydia, so she went to her and shook her by the shoulder. "Don't be an idiot, Emily," she snapped. "You've had a nightmare, that's all. Who on earth could be after you?" George had brought her some brandy by that time, and she gulped it down. She looked better, but it had the effect of making her sorry for herself, and for the next few minutes she cried and told of her long years of service and no life of her own. But they could not get her to say what she was afraid of, or to tell who she thought was after her. In a half hour or so she was better, however, and her story was an odd one. Her room is on the front of the house, as I have shown, and across the hall from her mother's. She had gone to bed early, after taking another sleeping powder. Her stepfather and Margaret were shut in the library talking, she thought, about her mother's estate. And she went to sleep almost as soon as she went to bed. She had locked her door, of course. They all did, since what she referred to as their trouble. She did now know how long she had been asleep when something roused her. It was a movement or a sound on the porch roof, and she sat up in bed and saw a figure outside.